In the year 1095, a single speech delivered by Pope Urban II set vast forces into motion. Within months, tens of thousands of people across Europe abandoned their homes and began marching toward lands most of them had never seen. They believed they were answering a divine call, one that promised salvation, honor, and eternal reward. What followed became known as the Crusades. The Crusades were not a single war, but a long series of military campaigns that lasted nearly 200 years. They reshaped Europe, devastated regions of the Middle East, and left scars that still influence global politics and religious relations today. At the center of it all stood Jerusalem, a city sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Control of this city became a symbol far larger than its walls or streets. To many in medieval Europe, the Crusades were presented as holy wars sanctioned by God. Popes offered forgiveness of sins, rulers saw opportunities for land and influence, and ordinary people sought meaning, escape, or survival in a harsh world. Yet beneath the religious language were political rivalries, economic pressures, and deep fears of external threats. From the Christian perspective, these wars were framed as defensive responses to centuries of conflict and loss. From the Muslim perspective, they appeared as sudden invasions by foreign armies driven by violence and conquest. Both sides believed they were acting with moral justification, and both would suffer immense consequences. By the time the crusading era came to an end, entire regions had been transformed. Millions were dead, empires were altered, and memories of these wars became deeply embedded in collective identity. To understand the Crusades is not just to study medieval warfare, but to examine how belief, power, and fear can reshape the course of history. By the late 11th century, the world surrounding the Mediterranean was divided, tense, and deeply interconnected. Western Europe was emerging from centuries of political fragmentation after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Power was decentralized, literacy was limited, and most people lived short, difficult lives bound to the land. Yet the Church stood as the one institution that crossed borders, unified belief, and claimed authority over kings and peasants alike. To the east, the Byzantine Empire still stood as the direct continuation of the Roman state. Its capital, Constantinople, was one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the world, protected by massive walls and sustained by trade routes linking Europe and Asia. However, the empire was under growing pressure. In 1071, Byzantine forces suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Manzikert against the Seljuk Turks, losing control of much of Anatolia, the empire's primary source of manpower and food. Beyond Byzantium stretched the Islamic world, which had expanded rapidly since the 7th century. Muslim rulers governed a vast region from Spain to Central Asia, connected by trade, scholarship, and shared religious traditions. Jerusalem had been under Muslim control for centuries, and for much of that time, Christian pilgrims were generally allowed to visit the city. This situation began to change as political instability increased, and new powers, including the Seljuk Turks, rose to prominence. The Seljuks were Sunni Muslim warriors who had moved westward from Central Asia and gradually taken control of large territories. Their expansion brought them into direct conflict with Byzantium and shifted the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean. While religious differences existed, the immediate concerns were political and military rather than theological. Control of land, taxation, and strategic routes mattered far more than abstract doctrine. Faced with mounting losses, Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos made a calculated decision. He appealed to Western Europe for military assistance, requesting mercenary forces to help defend imperial territory. This appeal was not intended to unleash a massive religious war, but it would soon be transformed into something far larger. When Pope Urban II responded, he reframed the request as a sacred mission, blending Byzantine desperation with Western religious fervor. At the Council of Clermont in 1095, Urban called on Christians to take up arms in defense of their faith and fellow believers. He spoke of violence against Eastern Christians and the need to reclaim sacred lands, though historians debate how accurately these claims reflected reality. What is clear is that his message resonated deeply with an audience shaped by hardship, faith, and a culture of warfare. Europe was primed for a movement that promised meaning, unity, and divine reward. The world into which the Crusades were born was not divided simply between Christians and Muslims. It was a complex landscape of rival empires, shifting alliances, and competing ambitions. Understanding this broader context is essential because the Crusades did not erupt from sudden hatred, but from long-standing tensions, misunderstandings, and power struggles that had been building for generations. The response to Pope Urban II's call spread with astonishing speed. Preachers carried the message across France, the German lands, and Italy, adapting it to local audiences. For nobles, the Crusades offered land, status, and a sanctioned outlet for violence. For peasants and townspeople, it promised forgiveness of sins and a chance to escape poverty, death, or social constraints. Before any organized armies reached the eastern Mediterranean, waves of poorly armed followers set out on their own. This movement, later known as the People's Crusade, was led by figures such as Peter the Hermit. Lacking discipline, supplies, or military leadership, these groups caused chaos along their route. In several regions, Crusaders turned their violence against Jewish communities, particularly in the Rhineland, marking one of the darkest episodes of the crusading era. By the time these early groups reached Byzantine territory, they were exhausted and unruly. Emperor Alexios I quickly transported them across the Bosphorus to remove them from his lands. In Anatolia, they were met by organized Seljuk forces and almost entirely destroyed. The disaster revealed a central reality of the Crusades. Religious enthusiasm alone could not survive against trained armies and strategic planning. The main Crusader armies followed more slowly, led by experienced nobles such as Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse, and Baldwin of Boulogne. These forces were better equipped and more disciplined, though they remained united only loosely by shared purpose. Upon reaching Constantinople in 997, tensions emerged immediately. Alexios demanded oaths of loyalty, requiring Crusader leaders to promise that any former Byzantine territory they captured would be returned to the empire. Reluctantly, most leaders agreed, though distrust lingered on both sides. The Crusaders crossed into Anatolia with Byzantine support and scored an important victory at Nicaea, which was returned to imperial control. Soon after, they defeated Seljuk forces at the Battle of Dorylaeum, opening the road across Anatolia. Despite military success, the march was brutal, marked by hunger, heat, and disease. As the Crusaders advanced southward, unity began to fracture. Baldwin of Boulogne broke away and seized control of Edessa, establishing the first Crusader state. This decision signaled a shift in priorities as territorial ambition began to compete with the original goal of reaching Jerusalem. Other leaders pressed onward, eventually arriving at the city of Antioch, one of the most heavily fortified cities in the region. The siege of Antioch, beginning in late 997, tested the crusade to its limits. Supplies ran low, morale collapsed, and desertion became common.
After months of stalemate, the Crusaders captured the city through betrayal rather than direct assault. Almost immediately, they found themselves besieged in turn by a Muslim relief force, trapped inside the very city they had fought to take. At this moment of desperation, a claimed religious vision transformed the situation. A relic known as the Holy Lance was reportedly discovered, believed to be the spear that pierced Christ's side. Whether genuine or not, the relic restored morale. In June of 998, the Crusaders launched a desperate attack and defeated the larger Muslim force, securing Antioch but further deepening internal rivalries over control of the city. It would be nearly a year before the Crusaders finally marched toward Jerusalem. When they arrived in June 999, they faced a well-defended city under Fatimid control, not Seljuk. With limited manpower and resources, the Crusaders built siege equipment from scarce materials and launched a final assault. On July 15, 999, they breached the walls and captured Jerusalem. What followed was a massacre of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, described even by contemporary Christian sources. The violence shocked the region and cemented the Crusaders' reputation in the Islamic world. For the Crusaders, however, the capture of Jerusalem was seen as divine confirmation of their mission. They established new Crusader states, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and elected rulers to govern them. These victories did not bring stability. The Crusader states were small, isolated, and dependent on continued support from Europe. Muslim powers, initially divided, gradually began to organize resistance. In the mid-12th century, leaders such as Zengi and later Nur ad-Din unified large territories and framed the conflict as a religious struggle in defense of Islam. The turning point came with the rise of Saladin, a Kurdish military leader who united Egypt and Syria under his rule. Unlike earlier rulers, Saladin combined political skill with religious legitimacy. In 1187, his forces confronted the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin. The Crusaders, weakened by internal divisions and strategic mistakes, suffered a devastating defeat. Following Hattin, Saladin recaptured Jerusalem, ending nearly 90 years of Crusader control. Unlike the events of 999, the city's inhabitants were largely spared massacre, though many were ransomed or displaced. The loss of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through Europe and prompted the Third Crusade. Kings and emperors now took the field, including Richard the Lionheart of England and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. The Third Crusade achieved mixed results. Frederick died en route, weakening German forces, while Richard proved a formidable commander against Saladin. Despite several victories, Richard failed to retake Jerusalem. In 1192, the two leaders agreed to a treaty allowing Christian pilgrims access to the city, while it remained under Muslim control. The crusade ended without restoring the original goal. Subsequent crusades drifted further from their stated purpose. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, never reached the Holy Land at all. Instead, internal politics and financial pressures led Crusaders to sack Constantinople in 1204, devastating the Byzantine Empire. This act permanently fractured relations between Eastern and Western Christianity and weakened the very empire the Crusades had originally aimed to protect. Later Crusades targeted not only Muslims, but also Christian heretics and political enemies within Europe. Meanwhile, Crusader holdings in the Eastern Mediterranean steadily declined. Muslim powers continued to consolidate strength, and by the late 12th century, remaining Crusader strongholds fell one by one. In 1291, the fall of Acre marked the effective end of Crusader rule in the Holy Land. What began as a call to defend sacred space had evolved into a cycle of conquest, retaliation, and transformation. Each stage of the Crusades reshaped the motivations of those involved, shifting from religious zeal to political survival. The conflict had reached a point where retreat was no longer a simple option, and the consequences of earlier decisions now demanded a final reckoning.
The decisive turning point of the crusading era did not come with a single battle alone, but with the collapse of the Crusader world as a viable power in the Eastern Mediterranean. By the late 12th century, the fragile balance that had sustained the Crusader states was gone. They were surrounded by increasingly unified Muslim powers and weakened by internal rivalries, limited manpower, and reliance on distant European support. The Battle of Hattin in 1187 symbolized this collapse more than any other event. Crusader forces, led by King Guy of Lusignan, marched across arid terrain in an attempt to relieve the city of Tiberias. Deprived of water and harassed by Saladin's cavalry, the Crusader army disintegrated under the heat and pressure. When the battle ended, the relic of the true cross was captured, and the military strength of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was effectively destroyed. Saladin's subsequent campaign was swift and methodical. One by one, Crusader fortresses surrendered or fell with minimal resistance. When Jerusalem itself capitulated later that year, it marked a profound psychological and political shift. For the first time since 1099, the city was again under Muslim rule, and the idea of permanent Christian control of the Holy Land was fundamentally broken. Although later Crusades attempted to reverse this outcome, none succeeded in restoring the earlier Crusader dominance. The Third Crusade recovered some coastal territory, but failed to reclaim Jerusalem. Subsequent expeditions grew increasingly disconnected from their original purpose, driven more by European politics than religious necessity. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople confirmed that the crusading movement had lost its moral and strategic coherence. By the 13th century, Crusader states survived only as vulnerable coastal enclaves. They depended heavily on Italian maritime powers and military orders such as the Templars and Hospitaliers. Muslim rulers, now better organized and experienced, steadily eroded Crusader defenses. The fall of Acre in 1291 ended the last major Christian foothold in the Holy Land. This moment marked the irreversible end of the Crusades as a territorial project in the East. What remained were memories, legends, and grievances carried back to Europe and preserved in the Islamic world. The wars had failed to secure lasting control of Jerusalem, but they had permanently altered political boundaries, religious identities, and historical memory on both sides. The end of the Crusader states did not bring peace to the regions they had once occupied. In the Eastern Mediterranean, Muslim rulers consolidated control over former Crusader territories, integrating them into larger political systems. Trade resumed across old routes, but the scars of repeated warfare remained visible in ruined cities and depopulated landscapes. Memories of invasion and resistance became part of regional historical consciousness. In Europe, the consequences were far-reaching and complex. The Crusades strengthened the authority of the papacy in the short term, but repeated failures gradually weakened its moral influence. Monarchs gained experience in taxation, administration, and large-scale warfare, accelerating the growth of centralized states. At the same time, entire noble lineages were extinguished, while others rose through crusading wealth and prestige. Economic and cultural exchanges increased despite the violence. Contact with the Islamic world exposed Europeans to advanced medical knowledge, mathematics, philosophy, and classical texts preserved in Arabic. Trade networks expanded, particularly through Italian city-states such as Venice and Genoa, which profited immensely from Crusader logistics. These interactions contributed indirectly to intellectual movements that would later shape the European Renaissance. For the Islamic world, the Crusades reinforced ideas of collective defense and religious legitimacy. Leaders like Saladin became enduring symbols of unity and moral leadership, remembered long after their political structures faded. The experience also encouraged military and administrative reforms, strengthening states that would later confront new threats, including the Mongols. However, the devastation left by Crusader warfare slowed development in several regions for generations. Relations between Christian and Muslim societies were permanently altered. The Crusades hardened religious boundaries and deepened mutual suspicion, even when diplomatic and commercial ties continued. Narratives formed during this period were preserved in chronicles, sermons, and oral traditions, shaping how each side understood the other. These memories would be revived repeatedly in later centuries, often detached from their original medieval context. The legacy of the Crusades was not confined to borders or battles. They reshaped ideas of holy war, justified violence in the name of faith, and demonstrated how religion could be mobilized for political ends. Long after the last fortress fell, the consequences of the Crusades continued to influence world history, embedding themselves in identity, belief, and the language of conflict itself. The Crusades are often remembered as distant medieval wars, fought with swords, banners, and religious slogans. Yet their deeper significance lies not in the battles themselves, but in the choices that made those battles possible. They reveal how fear, belief, and ambition can merge into movements that feel inevitable, even when they are built on human decisions. The Crusades were not driven by faith alone, but by a complex web of power, survival, and identity. For those who lived through them, the Crusades were not history, but lived reality. Entire families were uprooted, cities were destroyed, and generations grew up knowing nothing but conflict. Each side believed it was defending something sacred, and that belief made compromise almost impossible. When faith becomes inseparable from political power, violence often follows. The echoes of the Crusades did not fade with the Middle Ages. They resurfaced in later conflicts, political rhetoric, and collective memory, often simplified or distorted to serve modern agendas. Understanding what actually happened allows us to separate myth from history and emotion from evidence. It reminds us that the past is rarely as simple as the stories told about it. The Crusades challenge us to ask difficult questions about responsibility and belief. How easily can moral certainty justify destruction? How often do sacred causes conceal human ambition? And what happens when societies stop listening to those they define as enemies? If this story made you reflect, share your thoughts in the comments. History becomes clearer when we examine it together. If you want more long-form, deeply researched stories like this, consider liking the video and subscribing. The past still speaks, and there are many more stories waiting to be understood.